Will Kingston's here, political commentator. Hard to believe, Will. Very good morning to you.
G'day, Mike. Geez, Labor MPs love inflating a CV, don't they?
They really do. But I mean, now it's starting to get dangerous. I mean, what's next? Are we going to get Rachel Reeves getting put in charge of NASA? You know, and they'll go, you know, yeah, you'll be able to do that. It's fine, no problem at all.
Well, maybe we could chuck her on the next flight to the moon and then be rid of her. It could actually be a good result.
Yeah. Well, I mean, next time Katy Perry's going up there.
Yeah, I saw that, and Bezos's wife at the same time. Yeah, I thought that was an odd one. But look, integrity matters in politics. We know this, and the Labor Party sadly shows a fundamental deficit of integrity when they do this sort of stuff.
Yeah, well, we were looking at the weekend. Jonathan Reynolds talks about saving British steel. But have a look at what he said to Laura Kunsberg yesterday on the BBC when he was actually asked about the future and whether it's going to be possible to even run the blast furnaces because they haven't got any fuel.
Taxpayers are now on the hook. So I'll ask you again, are you sure that you will have the supplies that you need to keep the furnaces burning?
I'm not going to get into the specifics of that for some very important reasons.
That's the central question, Secretary of State.
It is, but giving us the chance to do that was essential, and I'm not going to make my situation or the nation's situation more difficult by sharing some specific commercial aspects of that. But what we have done, with the support of parliamentary colleagues, I hugely appreciate the presence in Parliament yesterday of so many colleagues to do that, was essential to maintaining steel production in the UK and giving us a chance for that transition to the future, which we need. I said in Parliament yesterday, it's not a magic wand, it's not a panacea, but without the decisive action by the government yesterday, all was lost.
Yeah, well, all might be lost anyway. I mean, he could have just said no, couldn't he, to the answer to that question. I don't know if we're going to be able to safeguard the future of British steel, because he doesn't.
Yeah, but the other thing, and we're going to get to Southport in a moment, there's a thread that runs through these stories, and it is they don't trust you with information. They don't trust you. They think you are idiots. They think that you will then react in a particular way, which means that, therefore, we need to keep things from you. It is a theme that runs through this government. But the other thing is he doesn't have much to say, because the fact of the matter is that steel production is one of the most energy-intensive industries known to man, and you can't do it when the country's energy is twice as expensive as Europe or the United States because of our ridiculous net zero policies. Like, this is not a particularly complicated thing to understand, but unfortunately, because they've backed themselves into a corner on net zero, they now have to obfuscate and say silly things, which even the most, even the most layman observer can see through.
Absolutely right, and that is always going to be their problem. Yeah, let's move on to, not just to Southport, but also to what happened over the weekend in a prison, which is currently holding the brother of the dead Manchester Arena bomber, who was able to, believe it or not, despite the fact that he's been sentenced to 55 years in jail, have access to a kitchen where he could make weapons and where he could boil oil, basically, or boil butter and make it into oil, so he could throw it on some prison guards. It's unbelievable, isn't it?
There are two interconnected problems here, and they both come back to that scourge of identity politics that has infested our institutions, Mike. The first is it has now become apparent that Islamists are being appeased in our prisons and that Islamism is on the rise in the prison system. And I believe that appeasement, at least in part, would come from that old thing that says we're just too afraid of being called racist if we're a police officer or if we're a prison officer or if we're part of the prison hierarchy. And we've seen this story play out so many times. And the second thing is we know that our prisons are overcrowded and we know they're at breaking point. And in part, that is because we are locking people up for tweets and for non-crimes, and we're not actually focusing on the fundamentals, which should be keeping prison officers safe from genuinely dangerous people. You put those two things together, and these sorts of things are bound to happen.
Yeah, well, this is the problem. HMP Frankland in Durham, where this guy should not be really given anything other than a cell in which he isn't allowed to leave. You know, the idea that he's allowed to cook for himself, he's allowed to stab, the two prison officers who are currently in quite critical life-threatening condition. They seem to be stable, but, they won't be the same after this. He threw boiling butter over a female prison guard. Why there's a female prison guard there is another question that I would be asking. Robert Jenrick is saying, surely this should now be a watershed moment for how we treat extremists in prison. And he's right, because he's the guy that's pointed out that an awful lot of these prisons are now also under the sort of the pin, if you like, under the thumb of Muslim jihadist gangs.
Yeah, well, I've also been following this quite closely on social media, and it has raised the spectre of the death penalty once again, and I can completely understand why. One of the big problems, and this is actually something which is difficult for any prison to solve, is when a guy knows he's going to be in jail for the rest of his life with no possibility of parole, then there's no real disincentive not to do this sort of atrocious stuff. So I think it's completely understandable that some people are saying, well, in order to save the lives of people who work in the prison system, something like the death penalty may be an appropriate deterrent in the future. I have mixed feelings on it, but I can completely understand why that conversation is taking place.
Yeah, I mean, certainly you hear it a lot from people that watch and listen to this show, but I mean, I'm not particularly in favour of that, but what I would be in favour of doing is putting somebody in a very unpleasant cell and just leaving them there until they rot, you know, and they should not be given any rights, they should not be allowed out for exercise, you know, all sorts of things that they can currently now do, they should not be allowed to do.
Yep, no, I have nothing to add to that. I agree entirely.
And the same would go for this absolute scumbag who committed those awful murders in Southport. But an interesting report out, Commons Home Affairs Committee coming out today in the Telegraph, saying basically that the police got it wrong when they were silent because they actually caused the atmosphere which made the riots worse.
Yeah, well, again, I go back to what I said before in that there is this sense amongst our elite classes, particularly in the judiciary and the policing system, that the public are not to be trusted with information. And this is another example. But there is a caveat here, and everyone will note that when there is a white working class man that is being accused of a crime, it seems that their faces are splashed over social media very quickly, often from those police Twitter accounts that seem to take this sort of glee in locking up white working class men for crimes that they see as being against the multicultural order of modern Britain.
Yeah.
So I think the thing that really annoys people is maybe the prosecution did do what they needed to do by the letter of the law. I don't know. But it is that feeling in the pit of your stomach, which I know many viewers and many listeners would have, which is if this was someone of a different ethnicity, they would have been treated differently. It is the fundamental problem with justice in this country today.
Yeah, absolutely right. Let's talk about Tulip Siddiq. She's all over the papers this morning because she's now facing an arrest warrant in Bangladesh over claims of corruption, which is kind of ironic given that she was appointed to be the Minister against corruption in this particular Labour government. She's a very, very close friend of Keir Starmer. Some people say she's his closest political friend and ally. It took a long time to get her out of the cabinet, you know, because the allegations about her and her crooked auntie, and I don't think there's any problem calling her that, who used to run Bangladesh and siphoned off quite a bit of money. It took them about 8 weeks before Starmer realised that she'd have to resign, and even in his kind of acceptance of her resignation, he was more or less saying, we'll see you soon, I'm sure you won't be away for long. But it now looks like she's got some pretty serious questions to answer in Bangladesh.
Yeah, I'm a tad torn because Bangladesh is a corrupt country and I wouldn't put it past their anti-corruption commission to be corrupt. So I'm not going to purely rely on what they've said as gospel. At the same time, another part of me said, where there's smoke, there's fire. But whatever may be the case, this is a terrible look for the Labor government. You should never have put someone in as a corruption minister when there is even the faintest hint that there may be corruption problems related to him or her. So I think it does show a lack of judgment from Starmer. And it also shows this tendency that he has to be incredibly obdurate, in that it was obvious from the get-go that this was not going to be a tenable position for her, and it's obvious he needed to cut her loose. But he has this tendency just to be pig-headed and not listen and not respond to the mood of the moment, which again is because I think he is a robot and he doesn't have any sort of people skills or empathy to be able to judge the mood in the way that the great politicians of the past were able to. So this is a lack of judgment story for me on the part of Starmer.
Yeah, well, he also has quite a few lacks of judgment, doesn't he? I mean, he had a lack of judgment when he appointed Louise Haigh to be Transport Secretary. As it turned out, she had a conviction for fraud, which either he didn't know about or she didn't tell him about, but either way, he should have done. He then had the problem with that guy who had to resign because of some WhatsApp references that he made to pensioners dying, which was another one that he lost. He's had Tulip Siddiq. He's had all manner of problems with various cabinet ministers that he's appointed. And he's now got a Secretary of State for Trade and Industry who has been proven to be a liar, who said he was a solicitor when he wasn't. He's got Rachel Reeves, who faked a CV, had sort of nicked somebody else's book and pretended it was her own, called herself a chess champion, called herself an economist. The list goes on and on of all of these people he's appointed to positions of quite powerful kind of influence, who are not quite what they say they are.
And the thing is that these stories hit harder against Labor than they would against, let's say, a Conservative government led by someone like Boris Johnson, who we know is a bit of a rogue and a mountebank. The only thing Starmer has that comprises his brand is, I follow the rules. I am an international human rights lawyer. And so when you see examples of people so flagrantly not following the rules, it makes him look like a hypocrite. And that is the one thing that people cannot tolerate in their politicians more than anything else. They can tolerate mistakes. They can even tolerate poor behaviour, but hypocrisy annoys people immensely. And what this just creates the perception of is a government that is trying to moralise, trying to clutch at pearls and virtue signal, whilst they themselves act in the wrong way. And that's something that really, really annoys people.
It does. And I'll tell you what's been annoying people this morning, as well as a story on the front page of the Telegraph. NHS Trust discriminates against white job applicants by manipulating interview shortlists in favour of black and ethnic minority candidates. I mean, we've seen this in the police in the last week. We've seen it in the RAF before. Everybody knows it's wrong, and yet they're still doing it.
Yeah, I just find this so incredibly depressing because, some people say, well, we're past peak woke, we're done with this nonsense. And then you realise that the institutions of the United Kingdom, and indeed many of the institutions across Europe and Australia, I think the US is now finally back on the right track, but many of the institutions are so infested with this ideology that it's going to be incredibly difficult to rip out. And it starts well before that, I think, in our education sector, where every kid who's coming out with some sort of a degree has been brainwashed for 3-4 years. In fact, if you go back to schools, even longer, with this identity politics nonsense. And so I think if you want to sort this stuff out, you need to target the institutions. But I think you also need to start with the education system the next time that either Reform or the Conservatives get in government, to say, we're not going to stop this stuff in the judiciary or in, Whitehall until we actually say what are kids learning in schools and then taking into their job.
Absolutely right. Will, good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed. Will Kingston, political commentator there.